Hi everyone. This week, or rather the next couple of weeks, are going to be a bit different. I'm going to cover two very underreported on murders from Granite Bay, California. I know what you're probably thinking. I started off this podcast with a case of Eileen Michelhoff, and my most recent episode was on Jenny Lynn, both from the Bay Area of California, and so it probably seems like I'm kind of picking on California. Remember, I'm a weekly podcast, so over time, I'm going to hit a lot of places. But when I stumbled upon these two, the details were just so odd, I was shocked that it was the first time I'd heard of them. I did a pretty big deep dive, and I want to be able to take the time with them that they deserve, so I broke it into my first two-parter. One will be released today, and the other next Monday. Investigators have said in interviews that they don't believe these two cases I'm covering are related, but they haven't really given the reason why. It's worth mentioning that these cases have some similarities. They both happened to two women in the same town just a couple of years apart. Both were victims in their 30s who died by ligature strangulation. Both were bold and brazen abductions of young mothers, and both did not appear to be victims of sexual assault. They had some differences, though, in how they were found, including the timeline for how long they were found after their abduction, and even possible motivations. But the biggest thing is that both of these cases have a fair amount of evidence. Evidence that there just wasn't much to do with back in the early 90s, but nowadays could be a game changer. The ability to solve both of these murders is so close, so I want to share their stories in the hopes that it reignites just one lead, one tip that could make the difference. This is A Simpler Time, True Crime, and today I'm going to share with you the Granite Bay Murders Part 1, the murder of Cindy Wanner. Cynthia K. Stroh Wanner, who went by Cindy, was born on May 8, 1956 in Dickinson, North Dakota, to parents Ale and Helen Stroh. Cindy came from a big family and had 4 siblings, 2 brothers and 2 sisters. As those children grew into adults, they all kind of relocated to different places. Her 2 brothers moved to Montana, and her sisters both moved out to the Sacramento area of California. Her parents also relocated out to Arizona. After graduating from Dickinson High School, Cindy had married the love of her life, Bob Wanner. He was also local to the area, and they knew each other and wanted to start their life together. With all of her family out of the North Dakota area, they decided to relocate themselves and moved to the Denver area in the early 1980s. There they welcomed a daughter named Carly Rose. They were finding their way and they loved Denver, but things took a turn when the company Bob was working for closed its doors, leaving him without a job. They decided to be closer to her family and try to get on their feet, so they relocated once again, this time to Rancho Cordova in California. Getting on their feet is exactly what happened. Bob landed a job as an engineer, and Cindy became pregnant with their second child, who they welcomed at the end of 1990, another daughter named Ashley. By the fall of 1991, they were still struggling financially, though. The Wanners attended church at Capital Christian Center, and according to Pastor Glenn Cole, Cindy had recently approached him to ask about help finding a job. She also had taken some clothes donated from the church to have a garage sale to help raise money to pay for upcoming ear surgery for Ashley. One way she did make a little bit of extra cash on the side was helping to clean her 2 sisters' houses, which she did on Mondays. Cindy's sister and brother-in-law, Susan and Phil Rye, had just moved into a brand new newly built, custom-built home, in fact, in Granite Bay, California, in the fall of 1991. This is in the suburbs of Sacramento. The house was very upscale, and it was in a nice neighborhood, 4 bedrooms, 3 full baths, and reportedly cost $320,000 at the time. Now, that's still a ton of money for me, but I know in California that's nothing for housing, and so I looked up, and houses in this area definitely cost over $1 million now. But also, again, it's California, and I feel like the real estate's just not comparable there to anywhere. It's just its own little world. So just take my word for it, very upscale. That's the best I can do. So yes, each Monday, Cindy would come over and clean for a little bit of cash, and she'd bring Ashley with her while Carly Rose went to preschool. Bob was often off on Mondays, so he would get Carly Rose from preschool and then come meet Cindy at the Rise. On November 25th, 1991, that's exactly how it was supposed to work out, just like that. Phil and Susan had a busy day, so they were in and out. That morning, they had been away for most of the morning, helping settle the trust of Phil's parents. They got back home around 11:30, but had to leave again shortly after noon, sometime between 12:15 and 12:30 p.m. They said everything seemed happy and normal. Cindy had Ashley in a high chair, and I have some pictures of that for the Instagram. It's one of those little high chairs that kind of attaches to the table. So Ashley was sitting in that, and she was eating some Cheerios while Cindy helped clean things up. As they were leaving, Cindy had just pulled out supplies to clean the bathroom. Only about 45 minutes had passed when Cindy's husband, Bob Wanner, showed up to the house. He had little Carly Rose in tow, and he had just picked up her from daycare after picking up wood from the Rise previous residence in Rancho Cordova that he was bringing to the new house. They had only been in this house for about 6 weeks, so they were still doing some of that moving shuffle. He had heard Ashley crying through the door. He knocked and he rang the doorbell, but nobody answered, and he noticed that the door was open, so he went in. There he was puzzled. He saw Ashley sitting there crying in her high chair. He called out for Cindy, but didn't hear anything in return. It was confusing because her car was still in the driveway, and her shoes were still sitting right there. Her jacket was laid out, and her cleaning supplies were still set up in the bathroom. But Cindy and her purse were gone. The house was otherwise in pristine condition. There was no blood anywhere or signs of actually anything being out of place, period. No struggle took place, and nothing looked like it was missing. Within a couple of minutes, Phil Rye actually called back to the house, and Bob answered the phone. They quickly exchanged information about the situation, about how Cindy wasn't here, but she had left baby Ashley behind. They both felt in their gut that something terrible had happened because this was just not like Cindy. So they mobilized and called police. Detective Bill Summers was one of the first people who responded. For a brief moment, he considered what everybody considers when an adult just goes missing. Did she run away, and did she have a reason to just run away from her life? But again, it just didn't make any sense. She was a devoted mother and just left her baby there. And not only her baby, but things like her shoes and her jacket and her car, so I'm not quite sure where she would be going. After a brief moment of that consideration, they pretty quickly ruled that out as a scenario. Cindy lived what they described as a very low-risk lifestyle, and she wasn't engaged in any type of behavior or activity that would put her at higher risk. Just a reminder of my personal belief system, I don't believe that any victim's behavior sets them up for violent crime. I think that criminals shouldn't commit violent crime. However, it is a fact of our world, and this is a very baseline thing that people do in investigations to determine the likelihood that somebody was a victim of any particular type of crime. So in this case, Cindy was not engaged in sex work, she wasn't engaged in the drug scene, or any type of risky financial situation. She didn't have enemies, nothing that would be a first lead for investigators to follow up on. The front door of the house was unlocked, and it was unclear if it had been left unlocked and that a perpetrator may have just opened it and entered, or if it just stayed unlocked after they left, because I doubt the perpetrator was going to make sure they locked up after the kidnapping. But it's possible that somebody came to the door and used some sort of ruse that made Cindy open the door and let them in. One thing that friends and families told investigators is that Cindy would have never left Ashley there without a struggle. So the thought was that whoever did this used Ashley as leverage or possibly threatened Ashley's well-being to get Cindy to cooperate, because that's the only explanation for how she would have just left. She would have absolutely left and sacrificed herself if it meant protecting her baby, but otherwise she would have put up a fight. The house itself was combed for fingerprints, but there was nothing. No evidence, no prints. But there was one thing just outside of the door. One stray cigarette butt, and neither the Wanners or Rise smoked. The cigarette itself didn't have any fingerprints on it, but it was the only thing they had to go on, so they bagged it and kept it as evidence. A description of Cindy went out to the public. She was listed as 5'8" and 135 pounds with brown hair and hazel eyes. She wore glasses and was last seen in blue jeans and a bright pink sweater. Her taupe-colored vinyl purse disappeared with her. Police also contacted Cindy's bank to put a hold on her ATM card. And pretty quickly, the police suspected foul play. Not only that, they felt it was a true stranger abduction. The men with the closest proximity to her life were her husband Bill and her brother-in-law Phil Rye. Both had airtight alibis, but for good measure, they were given polygraph tests and passed. Over the next few days, the police were incredibly thorough in their search of Granite Bay. They conducted 21 independent searches over 5 square miles of the Granite Bay area. This was on horseback, by helicopter, on foot, and on motorcycle. They searched vacant lots, they spoke to neighbors, but they came up empty, and within a few days, they had to pull back on the full-scale search. Now, don't get me wrong, this by no means meant they were giving up. It's just that the on-the-ground search wasn't working, so they needed to shift their focus and their strategy. By November 28th, they had brought in the FBI. According to Placer County Sheriff's Inspector Johnny Smith, they had now ruled out family and friends and any past associates or relationships. This was a stranger abduction, and that's why they were bringing the FBI in, for their expertise. It's also because they felt it was possible she could have been taken across state lines, which then makes it a federal crime. They reported at this time that they had received over 20 telephone calls of possible sightings after police posted flyers all over the region, but none of them helped find Cindy. I believe I've mentioned this before in another episode, but there is a phenomenon about how if you see a composite sketch, it's human nature to wire your brain to then kind of match that to people in the area. And sometimes you can encounter somebody, say, just out at a gas station or a restaurant, and your brain will sort of mold them to look like that composite sketch. So that goes for composite sketches and missing persons flyers, and that's why you get so many different sightings. On Friday, December 9th, 1991, Placer County Sheriff's Department shared a bulletin for local law enforcement to be on the lookout for 2 men in a white van who were seen in the Granite Bay area around the same time Cindy disappeared. It was an unknown make, but they said it was dirty and had a broken outside window. Someone had taken down a partial plate, IP82. The men were said to be Hispanic with scraggly and bushy hair. The next day, on December 10th, police reported a setback that they had encountered 6 days earlier on December 4th. A detective was making a routine follow-up call to Cindy's bank to see if there had been any movement on her card, and the person on the other line had some shocking information. Oh yeah, that card, it was used around 4 p.m. on November 25th. Yes, you heard that right. Within just a couple hours of when Cindy went missing, someone had used her card to withdraw $40 from a mini-mart called AM/PM at Auburn Boulevard and Greenback Lane in Citrus Heights, about 9 miles from the site of the kidnapping. Just 52 minutes prior to that transaction, the sheriff's department had asked the card to be frozen, but the bank had a breakdown in communication and that message didn't get passed on. A spokesperson for Wells Fargo Bank said they didn't realize they were supposed to contact police if the card was used, just that they were to freeze it and report any of the day's activity up to that point. But that doesn't make sense because police had called before the transaction, but obviously the card wasn't frozen. So clearly they were just trying to cover their butts. The AM/PM store had video surveillance around their ATM, but because 9 days had passed, the video had been written over. Remember, this is 1991, so this was recorded on actual tapes that you would have to, at a point, record over to be able to restart footage, whereas nowadays there's cloud-based storage and it doesn't really work like that. To say this was a devastating blow to Cindy's family and investigators is a huge understatement. I mean, they had the potential to see the suspect on video and go from there. I can only imagine how that felt to know that they were so close, but that a technical human error prevented them from possibly solving this case sooner and possibly finding Cindy alive. But at this point, they were still holding out hope for that. To be clear, it was cautious hope because a fair amount of time had passed and they really didn't feel Cindy was going to be found alive at this point. But they were still operating that way and still holding out hope. It did give them one small piece of information to go off of, though. Cindy's PIN was used at the ATM, so whoever used her card either knew her PIN anyways, or more likely, forced Cindy to give them her PIN. Even after finding this out on the 4th, police had delayed releasing this to the media because they were hoping that if they waited out a little longer, someone would attempt to use the card again. But they didn't, so at that point they decided to just be transparent about what had happened. It's so confusing because within just a few hours of her abduction, she had been taken to an ATM, but only $40 was taken out and then never again. The quick timeline that they went to the ATM would indicate that robbery was some kind of motive, but why only take $40 and then never do this again? Detectives also used the lead about the ATM card to search the general area around this convenience store in Citrus Heights. They spoke to employees that worked there to see if they remembered seeing anything out of the ordinary, and they combed area businesses, but they came up empty, just like with everything else in this case. By December 13th, police announced that they had cleared the white van of any involvement. They didn't really say if they had located it or not, but they had ruled it out. Then, on the very next day, December 14th, 1991, police got a big break, but not the one that they were hoping for. I wanted to take a moment to thank you for listening this far to my little independent podcast. It might be little right now, but I have big goals to get these lesser-known cases out there and grow a bigger audience. This probably goes without saying, but researching cases that are not as visible in the media takes a lot more time. But it's important to me that these cases get visibility. There are a few main ways that you can help me with this endeavor. First and foremost, sharing this podcast with your friends and family helps immensely. Second, subscribing and leaving 5-star reviews on any of the listening platforms helps get this out there. And lastly, following us on socials at Simpler Time Crime Pod on Instagram, as well as Facebook's A Simpler Time True Crime Facebook page. Engaging with posts on there and sharing them helps me reach a wider audience. Thank you so much for listening. Now, back to the show. On December 14th, 1991, a 24-year-old man named Kelly Price was quail hunting around 3 p.m. outside of a little community called Baker Ranch at the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains and about 35 miles northeast of Granite Bay. He walked down a familiar trail about 50 yards off the road when he spotted something horrible. There lay a woman laying nude with brush and branches over her. Kelly was visibly shaken and ran to call authorities. While no official ID was able to be made on that same day, authorities did give Cindy's family a heads up. The body they found matched Cindy's description and had Cindy's tattoos. Sheriff Don Nunes told the Press Tribune, quote, "Tattoos on the woman's body are consistent with tattoos of Wanner's, and the stage of decomposition is consistent with the 11/25 missing date," end quote. The very next day, the body was positively identified as that of Cindy Wanner, but police walked back their statement about decomposition. Cindy had been strangled with a rope or a cord of some sort. But outside of the visible ligature marks, her body was in pristine condition. She had no other cuts or bruising. She was nude except for a bra. However, there was no obvious signs of sexual assault. More so, her body was in too good of condition to have been exposed to the elements for 3 weeks. So much so that authorities dropped a bombshell. They said that pending the autopsy, which would give them more information on the state of decomp of her internal organs, they believe she had been alive for a couple of weeks after her abduction and had only been recently killed within 3 to 5 days of her body being found. And if that was the case, it also appeared she had been fed and allowed to bathe or shower. She just didn't look like she'd been held without food, water, or the ability to bathe or use the restroom for weeks. This was unlike anything that the investigators have ever encountered. What was the motive for keeping Cindy alive if there was no signs of sexual motivation and definitely no signs of financial motivation? Then so why abduct her, why keep her alive, and then ultimately choose to kill her anyways? An autopsy was performed on December 17th, and the state of her organs confirmed what police had already said, that she had only been dead for a few days and was likely kept alive for a couple of weeks after her abduction. Police theorized that she had been killed elsewhere and dumped there. There's a minimum maintenance dirt logging road off of Auburn Forest Hill Road that brings you to the area she was found in, but she would have had to be carried to her exact location. Cindy was covered with branches and leaves and was in deep underbrush. The loss of Cindy was unthinkable to her family and loved ones. On December 20th, 1991, 400 mourners attended the funeral that laid Cindy to rest. Her mother-in-law, Elsie Wanner, said, quote, "She was an absolutely perfect mother and so dear to us like a daughter. She was so good, friendly, and outgoing to everyone. We loved her dearly," end quote. Around this time, police began re-interviewing possible witnesses. They re-canvassed the neighborhood to see if they could find anybody new, and they didn't. All they found was that the neighborhood was in a panic. They couldn't believe that a young mother could just be abducted in front of her child in broad daylight in a small 45-minute window. They wondered if somebody was in their neighborhood watching them and watching their routines and their movements. There were a lot of stay-at-home moms in the neighborhood, and husbands were going on record to say that they were doubling down on their locks and security and really fearful of it happening again. Cindy's case and investigation into it cooled quickly. And if I'm being honest, the Placer County Sheriff's Office did not try to pretend they had something when they didn't. I've actually never seen a sheriff's department be so transparent about something like this. Normally, I feel like a case might be running into a wall, but sheriffs will still go on the record to say, like, well, we're following up new leads every single day. But every single report I have seen on this was the Placer County Sheriff's Office just being like, yeah, we have nothing. We need your help. We need leads. This is impossible. Someone come forward. And I don't know the right way to be. I don't know which is better, but this is just how they were on it. Though we should not conflate that with defeat. They were continuously trying to find new ways to look into this. So, of course, they looked into sex offenders, and they also looked at those who had recently been released from jail, but none of them really materialized as viable suspects, at least at this point. So, on the day after Christmas, on December 26th, 1991, a $10,000 reward was offered for info leading to the conviction in her case. This was brought together by a nonprofit group as well as her family coming up with funding together. As 1991 turned into 1992, the Sacramento Bee published an article with concerning crime statistics in Sacramento County. There had been a steep increase in homicides in the year of 1991. In the city of Sacramento itself, homicides had gone up to 73, whereas there had been just 48 in 1990. Police stated this was linked mostly to drug and gang violence. 60% of these victims were white, 17% black, 12% Asian, 8% Hispanic. The unincorporated areas outside of the city of Sacramento also saw an increase. In 1991, there was 66 homicides, up from 47. Placer County had 4. 2 of them, the first, were a couple in a relationship. 37-year-old Hugh Gresham and 33-year-old Jacqueline Sue Barton had been shot execution style in their rural home. Their case was actually cold until 2015, when an inmate who was already serving 50 years to life for the sexual assault of a family member was linked to the case by DNA evidence. Police wouldn't say what the motive was, but did say a drug warrant was issued to Hugh Gresham's same property a year prior, so it could have been related to that. The third victim was a woman named Gwendolyn Alex, whose son Keith allegedly murdered her and buried her in the Placer County hillside. There's very little information on this case, but it seemingly was pretty open and shut. The fourth was Cindy Wanner, the only 1991 Placer County homicide victim whose case still remains solved today. In January of 1992, the lab tests related to the sexual assault kit came back, but didn't do too much to further the case. There was no presence of seminal fluid or sperm, but investigators cautioned people from jumping to conclusions. Johnny Smith said, quote, "In effect, the lab tests didn't really add or subtract anything from our investigation. The absence of seminal fluid or sperm still doesn't rule out the possibility of a sexual attack," end quote. The testing also confirmed that Cindy didn't have any drugs or alcohol in her system at the time of her death. And lastly, the tests reaffirmed that she had been alive for 2 weeks and dead for just 3 to 5 days. By February of 1992, the sheriff's office went on record to say that they had ruled out family and close friends completely. They were certain that this was a stranger abduction and murder. At this point, they determined that this could be a serial killer. They actually compared the possible suspect to somebody like a Ted Bundy. They said what's difficult is that he could have just committed this random crime here and be all the way in a different state now. Nowadays, it's still not a perfect system, but serial killers have a harder time operating across the country because there's way more information sharing across state lines, whereas it was definitely limited in the 90s and even more limited before that. But I actually think of, like, for example, Rachel Morin, the recent case out of the Bel Air, Maryland area. Her DNA from her crime scene was linked within weeks to a crime that had occurred across the country, a home invasion assault in California. And so that's just something that wouldn't have happened during this time, but is now, and really ultimately helped lead towards her killer, who was recently arrested, allegedly. I mean, he really was arrested, but allegedly committed the crime. He's still got to go to court. I absolutely agree with them that in this case, it's quite possible that this could be someone who is a serial killer, but the part where they shared that the person might have moved out of state, I have to wonder if some of that was to take a little of the pressure off because the public was really laying it on thick. They were very concerned for their community, and so maybe them saying, hey, it could just be like Ted Bundy traveling around and he could be somewhere else now. I wonder if part of that was just to calm the nerves of the immediate community. Placer County Sheriff's detectives were already working with the FBI, but they partnered even further with the Behavioral Sciences Unit out of Quantico, Virginia, to try to develop a profile on this killer because there was just so many unique things involved in this that I've already mentioned, like keeping her alive for this period of time and ultimately killing her. But from everything I've researched, they've never actually released the criminal profile of this killer out to the public. So we don't really know what they're looking for, but they do. They shared at this point that they had received over 200 tips that just hadn't amounted to any information that progressed the investigation forward, which was disappointing to them. They were hoping to get the show on Unsolved Mysteries. And that just goes to show you that these types of platforms really do work. There were no podcasts back in the 90s. It was just two main shows, America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries. And the audience they attracted really helped solve a lot of crimes. I think of John Walsh and the work he did in particular, and how many fugitives were arrested and people who all of a sudden had run off to evade their crime, and neighbor spotted them in a mugshot on, America's Most Wanted. And the same thing can be said for Unsolved Mysteries. Robert Stack was the original host, and then there was Dennis Farina, and there's been a couple remakes, including now there's the Netflix one. But those shows really did serve a purpose and continue to serve a purpose to this day. But that's really all they had. And there's so many crimes across the country that they couldn't possibly feature all of them. But that's where this podcasting space comes in, because it really can help solve crimes. And there's so many of them that there really can be a wide range covered. I know that not all true crime podcasts are created equal, and not all engage in ethical and empathy-based content. However, in these cases, they really can make a difference in getting these colder cases out there to generate tips. When I came across Cindy's case, I noticed that it really hadn't been covered anywhere. And that was a driving motivator for me, because she has kids still out there and people who loved her who are living to this day without answers. Police actually staked out the neighborhood that Cindy was abducted from, and they sat there particularly on Mondays and looked for cars that passed through on more than one occasion around the time of the abduction, routinely on Mondays, to see if they could find any patterns. And so they would look up those license plates and registrations. One thing they said that they truly believed was that somebody saw something. There was no way that one person committed this crime and covered it up without someone seeing something or knowing about it. And they hoped that continued exposure would help jog people's memories and get them to talk. The next lead came on March 15th, 1992, but not in a way that they had hoped. Placer County Sheriff Don Noon said that the body of a 19-year-old single mom had been found in the tiny town of Cool, California, outside of Sacramento. He also said they believed that this case was related to the unsolved murder of Cindy Wanner. The victim's name was Veronica Martinez, and her case is still unsolved to this day as well. Veronica had been reported missing by her family in late January 1992. Veronica was dropped off at the grocery store named Pack and Save in Sacramento. She had told her friend that dropped her off that her brother was going to pick her up when she was done. But after that, she just disappeared. On March 7th, 1992, a person walking down the road collecting bottles spotted Veronica's body at the bottom of an embankment under heavy brush. She was found nude, except for a bra, and was wrapped in plastic. More horrifically, she was found decapitated. Veronica had 2 children and was 8 weeks pregnant with her third. She was waitressing and working hard to support her young family. One person of interest in her case was her boyfriend. You see, he was married to another woman. But both the boyfriend and the wife were interviewed, and nothing came of that. By early June, authorities had distanced themselves from the idea that the Martinez and Wanner cases were connected. Veronica's autopsy provided few clues. In fact, they couldn't even determine if the decapitation is what had killed her or if she had been murdered in another manner and the decapitation came after her death. In some way, both Veronica and Cindy's cases had a lot of similarities. Both were nude except for a bra. Both had tattoos. Neither appeared to be sexually assaulted. And both were dumped in heavily wooded rural areas with heavy brush about 15 miles apart. But even more so is this. Veronica's decomposition indicated she had only been dead for 7 to 10 days before she was found, but she had been missing for over a month. Just like Cindy, it appeared that she had been held captive for a period of time before she was eventually murdered and her body dumped in the wilderness. What's interesting to me about both of these cases is it seems like when the killer did ultimately dump their body, he did so in a way where he tried to keep them from being found. But ultimately, they were found relatively quickly, which is how it was pieced together by decomposition stages that they had been kept alive. Whereas if the killer had gotten his probable wish that they hadn't been found, and they weren't found until, say, years later with just skeletal remains or ever, they never would have been able to determine that whole piece of decomposition. And knowing that they had been kept alive, that would have been really hard to tell with just bones, because the thing that indicated that to the investigators that they had been held captive and stayed alive was based on the condition of the body and the organs. Now, I don't know why they don't feel that the two cases are related, because to me, that's a lot in common. The only thing I can think of is that the decapitation threw them off and the plastic bag, because that wasn't present with Cindy. But still, there's a lot of things in the other direction that does connect them. And the biggest one being that being held captive for a period of time. That, and also the whole piece around being nude except for a bra. Those are two big things that just scream connection to me. But either way, authorities sort of scratched that theories off. They speculated that Veronica could have been a victim of Cary Stayner, also known as the Yosemite Park Killer. After his 1999 arrest, FBI profilers felt that he had more victims than were indicated. He was 37 years old, and according to them, that's a pretty old age to get started in your serial killing career. And they felt that there were many other cases that could be tied to him. So anyways, after Stayner's arrest, they started looking back for cases that could have fit it, and Veronica's case came to mind. I think because of her decapitation. That's such a very specific way to leave a body, and he had killed 4 total people in Yosemite Park, and the most recent one, a woman named Joey Ruth Armstrong, she had been decapitated. Stayner had been employed as a maintenance man at Yosemite Park, and she was attending the Yosemite Institute, and she was a naturalist staying in one of the cabins there. And he was drawn to her case, or rather he was connected to her case, because a vehicle that matched the description of his had been spotted outside of there. So he was definitely considered for the Martinez murder because of that. I'm just going to come out here and say it. If it's Stayner or not, I really do think that there's a possibility that these cases are connected. And I, of course, am not an investigator, and I don't have all the information in front of me. I just have a hard time writing it off with all the information. The 1-year anniversary of Cindy's abduction came with grief from her loved ones and no new leads from detectives. According to a Sacramento Bee article on the anniversary of her abduction, Carly Rose Wanner, who was now 5, wrote her mother notes frequently. She would put them in an envelope, seal it, write the words "Mom" on it, and ask her Aunt Susan to mail them to her mom in heaven. Susan stepped in to fill the motherly void for her nieces as best as she could. Susan and Phil Rye described how everyone was constantly reliving the day of the abduction, the day of the murder being discovered, and how they were just unable to move on meaningfully or have any kind of closure without answers. As the neighborhood eventually felt less consumed by the fear of Cindy's abduction, Phil Rye issued a word of caution. He said, quote, We just feel that we don't want anyone to become complacent about this. We wouldn't want anybody to go through what we have, end quote. Placer County Sheriff's Office doubled down with this advice. Bill Summers said, quote, "We feel it was a stranger abduction. Why he picked this residence, we don't know. However, we feel this type of abduction could happen again," end quote. He went on to encourage people in the area not to open their door for solicitors or for anything else that could be used as a ruse to gain entry into a home. By August of 1993, Cindy's husband and 2 children had moved away from Sacramento County. Phil and Susan Rye had moved out of what was once their dream home, their new custom-built home in Granite Bay, and they moved away from the town and Placer County. It was just too painful for everyone to try to live in the area where Cindy's life had been cut so tragically short by evil. Bob Wanner sued Wells Fargo Bank on behalf of himself and his 2 children for the bank card debacle. He argued that Cindy could still be alive today had the card been reported to police in real time, but a judge threw the case out, citing that it was all just speculation. On the 3-year anniversary of the kidnapping in 1994, Placer County sheriffs made a bold statement in that they said they felt that the new leads they had were going to lead to a break in the case. They shared that people had come forward with information on names of people in 3 area counties and that they were going to be following up on those leads and interviewing people throughout the holidays. They also shared that they had been keeping evidence up their sleeves but wouldn't share what it was. They did say that it was strong enough that it could be used to rule people in or out. But that was it for a few years. That big break didn't ever come. Cindy's case never did make it to Unsolved Mysteries or America's Most Wanted, but in the early 2000s, it did land a half-episode spot on an early season of Cold Case Files. In it, Detective Bill Summers shared some of the evidence they had been keeping to themselves. One big thing was that her body around her neck and back area and in her hair had tiny green fibers in it and metal flaking. These were very unique. Several yards away from her body was a trash burn pile. Within the pile, there was a bag, and in that paper bag, there was a few beer cans, VHS tapes with pornography on them, and pornographic magazines. This bag also had those same green fibers and metal flaking when placed under the microscope. Detective Bob McDonald said he attended a DNA seminar in the early 2000s, and he shared Cindy's case with seasoned investigators, forensic experts, and other specialties in the hopes that they would have some new ideas for him. In the audience was a DNA expert from the California Department of Justice named Jill Springs. She remembered Cindy's case from living in the area at the time and agreed to give it a look. She used a laser light to look for trace semen on the porn magazine. She also took Cindy's bra to look for saliva, semen, or other bodily fluids in the breast area. They also took that random cigarette butt from the crime scene, as well as the beer cans, and swabbed the areas that would be touched by the mouth to check for saliva samples. At the time of that recording, if there had been any leads based off of that, authorities were keeping them hushed. Another new piece of information that came from that episode, where this is literally the only place I've seen this theory shared, was that she actually was killed within just a day or 2 of being abducted, but that she was frozen and that actually had slowed down decomposition. As I said, this is the only place that mentions that, and other articles to this day still state that they believe she was kept alive for a period of time. But if the frozen theory is true, that would make a lot of sense compared to the idea that someone would keep her alive for weeks and essentially was letting her shave and shower and brush her teeth and be fed and all of that. So that can't be determined for certain, but I did want to mention it. And that information from 20 years ago was the last information released publicly about Cindy's case. Nobody has been arrested, but police have made a few veiled comments over the years that lead me to believe they at least have someone in their sights. They've shared that there's a difference between evidence that can lead to an arrest and evidence that could lead to a conviction, and how you only get one shot, so you have to make it count. Someone wrote into the paper in 2017 asking if there was any hope in solving Cindy's case. Dina Irwin, a spokesperson for the Placer County Sheriff's Office, responded by saying that detectives have a substantial amount of evidence, but that they need witness statements to put that evidence into context. After the 2018 arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, also known as the East Area Rapist and Golden State Killer, many people speculated that Cindy could have been one of his victims. Her brother-in-law and sister used to live in a neighborhood where DeAngelo had another murder victim. He also was known to be outdoorsy and would spend time in the Granite Bay area and the area where Cindy was found. But DeAngelo was known more for entering people's homes and committing the crimes there, not abducting the victims and taking them to a second location. Also, DeAngelo's name now is almost synonymous with forensic genealogy or familial DNA, because that's how he was caught, and he had a landmark case being convicted of those murders based on that. So knowing that investigators have a wealth of evidence in Cindy's case, and DeAngelo is behind bars for the rest of his life, I doubt investigators would be super worried about blowing their one shot. There's plenty of DNA to compare to, so that leads me to believe that they've already checked on this and DeAngelo isn't their guy. There are others who speculate about another California serial killer, and chances are you've probably heard of him, the Zodiac Killer. People who study his movements say that he was still operating in the 1990s and had just switched his MO as he had promised in one of his police taunting letters. This one is a little far-fetched to me. It's just a hunch, and mostly it's just the passage of time that had significantly passed between the times that the Zodiac Killer was operating and the time of this crime. I mean, we're talking decades. But because we don't know who committed this crime, everything is still on the table. For me, I have a hard time discounting that it could be connected to Veronica Martinez's case. Police have also gone on record to say that they are sure her case isn't connected to the murder of a teacher from Granite Bay in 1993. But this case also has some similarities, and it was just too much to add in one episode. So her case will be covered next time on A Simpler Time, True Crime. In the meantime, if you have any information on Cindy's murder, now is the time to come forward. Police have said that they need witness testimony to corroborate the forensic evidence they have. Cindy's parents died without any answers as to what happened to their daughter. Cindy's own daughters are in their 30s now and living their adult lives without their mother by their side and with nobody being held accountable. Cindy would be in her late 60s today, and she should still be here. She never got to watch her children grow up or finish out her dream of building a life in California. She was just senselessly murdered. Was she kept alive for weeks, hoping to make it back to her children? If so, why? Why did any of it? For $40? For control? For sex? For some sick fantasy? Somebody out there knows something. And if you are that person with information, please contact Detective Chris Joyce at 530-889-7889. This has been A Simpler Time, True Crime. We'll be back with another episode next week. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review on whatever listening platform you're listening on right now, and share this podcast with your friends. I also will be sharing pictures to go along with this episode on Instagram and Facebook. Again, our Instagram is @SimplerTimeCrimePod, and the Facebook page is just called A Simpler Time, True Crime. In the show notes, you can always find our sources, and I'm also going to share some fellow podcasts that cover some of the killers that we mentioned in this episode, including Carrie Stainer and the East Area Rapist / Golden State Killer. They are covered far more in depth on those specific podcasts and more so than I ever could on this episode, particularly because we don't even know if they are related. Thank you so much for listening.